For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Huppert and I'm the President of the Jewish Community Council of Victoria. And on behalf of the JCCV, I'd like to welcome you all to this very important event. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Also like to acknowledge and welcome Steve Doron MP, Member for Oakley, representing the Minister for Equality Martin Foley, who sends his apologies. Mr David Davis MP, Shadow Minister for Equality, has RSVP'd and hopefully he will be here soon, and Sam Hibbins MP, Member for Paran. Also like to welcome Marion Lau from the Victorian Multicultural Commission, and all of you who've made the effort to come this evening. The Victorian Jewish community is diverse and to a certain extent represents a microcosm of the community in general. And the aim of the JCCV is to ensure that all Victorians who identify as Jewish feel that there is a place for them within our community. The purpose of this symposium and the Jade Youth Video Competition is to foster inclusion with our community for Jewish same-sex attracted and sex and gender diverse youth. We also hope that this applies to Jewish communities around the world. Whereas generally Israel's a country in which the LGBTI community is accepted, unfortunately it is not immune from hatred and prejudice. In this evening we remember Shira Banki, a young woman who was murdered while attending a gay pride rally in Jerusalem in support of a friend, and we have a memorial to her here this evening. This symposium can't be seen in isolation. I'd like to pay tribute to my predecessors in this role who have worked very hard to ensure that the LGBTI community feels part of the Jewish community generally. In particular, I'd like to mention John Searle, the current chair of the board of the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission, who, while president of the JCCV, established our LGBTI reference group. I'd like to thank the members of the reference group, and in particular JCCV Executive Member Doron Abramovici for helping to organise this evening, and also to thank David Marlowe and the rest of the JCCV staff for putting this evening together. Also acknowledge the support of the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria, whose support through the Hay Grant has made this evening and the video competition possible. And of course I'd like to thank the presenters who we'll be hearing from today and those who have been facilitating the workshops later. And I'd also like to welcome David Southwick, MP, Member for Caulfield, who has just arrived. Thank you for joining us, David. I'm now going to hand you over to Doron, who is your MC for this evening. So thank you very much. And
thanks, Jennifer. I don't like the term gay rights, lesbian rights, straight rights, trans, bi or intersex rights. We, the LGBTI community, don't want to be treated any differently to our straight family and friends. We want equality in the eyes of the law, and we want to feel included as part of society. What is social inclusion? It is my belief that every member of society has a right to feel valued and their differences respected regardless whether one has a disability, one's sexual orientation, gender identity, ethnicity, country of origin, colour of their skin, or a woman wanting a divorce. The Jewish Community Council of Victoria has a long and proud history of supporting LGBTI inclusion. However, this was accelerated in 2009 with the formation of the GLBTI, now known as the GLBTI Reference Group. The group's founder, former JCCV President John Searle, courageously opened his heart and home to the LGBTI community, with originating members Andrew Reicher, Julie Leader, Sally Goldner, Nathan Rose and myself. The group's initial task was to investigate areas of discrimination and vilification within Victoria's Jewish community, within Victoria's LGBTI Jewish community. With a report eventually released detailing findings and outlining recommendations. In 2013, under the helm of Nina Bassett, the JCCV signed up over 36 affiliates and non-affiliate community organisations to the No to Homophobia campaign, another milestone in the JCCV's history. This year, under the current president, Jennifer Huppert, and my first year as a board member and the Director of Social Inclusion, the JCCV yet again hit many milestones. The first one, winning a grant by the Youth Affairs Council of Victoria to support same-sex attracted and gender diverse young people. Our first community LGBTI Jewish forum raising awareness of LGBTI issues in our community, this forum tonight. A youth and community video project currently in the works. And very proudly that I can say, we welcome Keshet Australia to the JCCV as an affiliate on the 3rd of August, quite recently, just a month ago. So we very, very much welcome them with open arms. It is important to note that while there is still a lot of work to be done in education and awareness, as well as the inclusion of LGBTI Jews in mainstream Jewish community, we must give credit to many Orthodox, progressive and conservative leaders in our community who have and continue to support the fight for LGBTI inclusion and equality. I could not be prouder of the work the JCCV has done in this space in collaboration with affiliates, community organisations, government agencies and politicians from all sides. Before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to finish off with these words. I'm gay, so what? I have brown hair, so what? I have brown eyes, so what? What defines me as a human being is the following. I'm a proud Australian, I'm a proud Jew, I'm a proud Zionist. I honour, respect and love my parents, and I honour, respect and love my friends. Thank you. Our first speaker tonight, Shaun Staunton, is the LGBTI Communities Project Manager with Beyond Blue. Before taking his role in Victoria, he's worked and volunteered in the HIV and LGBTI sectors in Queensland and Tasmania. Please welcome Shaun to the stage.
So, just a little bit to begin about Beyond Blue and the work we do. So, this is just a bit of a snapshot of depression and anxiety in Australia, which are the two areas Beyond Blue works in. We're also moving into suicide prevention a little bit. So we know there's 1 million people in Australia living with depression and 2 million living with anxiety. This is just a quick snapshot of a campaign, one of our LGBTI campaigns. It was originally targeted to men, but that was because it was funded by the government in a men's priority funding stream. We've widened that out to the LGBTI community since then, and it's the Take Action Before the Blue Takes Over campaign. This is our Families Like Mine resource, which is for the families of LGBT people and gender diverse young people. It's an online ebook, and you can find that on our website. So I'm just going to be talking tonight a little bit about some of the research and some of the principles, I suppose, around Beyond Blue's work with the LGBTI communities. So I'll be talking about some of the findings around the key research reports more recently for the communities. So just to start, I want to give a bit of a snapshot of what the letters in the LGBTI acronym stand for, and you can see all that there, but I do just want to acknowledge that there's, outside of LGBTI, there's a range of identities and bodies and sexualities that people identify with. So I wanted to give a bit of a snapshot so that we're all on the same page in terms of LGBTI, but I want to acknowledge that the sector is really moving towards trying to capture a term or a line that really recognises the diversities in the communities, I should say. Term I tend to use is diverse sexualities, bodies and gender identities, because that recognises the diversity a bit more than just LGBTI. So what I'll be talking about tonight is the experiences of mental ill health in the LGBTI populations, rates of discrimination towards the communities, and what the research shows are the impacts of that discrimination. So really there can be three levels of discrimination: structural, which is caused directly or indirectly by the law, institutional, so for example the provision of services, or interpersonal, which is interactions between individuals. I want to acknowledge that there's a wide range of experiences for LGBTI people and other identities. It's not just a narrative of unhappiness and harassment. So people obviously have very rich lives, and people have experiences of struggle and difficulty at points in their lives, but I don't want anybody to think that that's the only experiences for LGBTI people. I will talk about that aspect of people's lives because that is relevant in terms of mental health, mental ill health in particular, but there's a lot more going on. I also want to acknowledge there's a very significant gap in research for people with intersex variations. I'm hopeful that that will start changing. There's a very significant national research project that I believe is wrapped up, and the findings for that will be coming out soon. But you will see as I go through my talk that there's not a lot of information in terms of research around the experiences of people with intersex variations. We know a bit around people's own experiences, but national large studies, there's a very significant gap there. When I go through the talk, I'll be using the labels that are used in the research for individuals. So you'll see that it changes a little bit: gender diverse, young people, transgender people, and that's reflective of the terms the research uses. So here's a bit of a snapshot of what's happening. So LGBT people have higher psychological distress scores than the national average. Almost 25% of lesbian, gay and bisexual people met the criteria for a major depressive episode in 2005, compared to only 7% of the general population. When we're looking at resilience, which is the ability for people to bounce back from traumatic experiences or events, resilience is much lower than the US average. We don't really have comparable Australian resilience data, so often it refers to data that's been captured in the US around the general community's resilience scores, but we know compared to the American averages that LGBT people have lower resilience scores. So scores are highest for transgender people, followed by bisexual people, same-sex attracted women, and then gay men. So there's different levels of distress in the LGBT communities. It's not just a blanket level of mental ill health or low resilience. So I think that's important to note. So nearly 80% of LGBT people have had experienced at least one episode of intense anxiety over the 12 months, so anxiety is quite significant. Almost 30% of trans people had reported a current major depressive syndrome. And this rate is even higher for trans people ever being diagnosed for both anxiety or depression. So not only are current rates very significant, significantly higher, but also the lifetime of ever being diagnosed is very, very high. So as I said before, there's not a lot of research, national, population-wide data around the experiences of people with intersex variations, but what's out there, some of the significant findings show that adults with intersex variations have psychological distress levels comparable to traumatised non-intersex women. And we also know from a range of areas and sources that involuntary surgery on infants born with intersex variations is very much a very, very significant issue. And there's a lot of fantastic lobbying and work being done around trying to remove that from happening, stop that from happening. In terms of suicide or self-harm, over 40% of trans adults had thought about suicide or self-harm in the previous 2 weeks, so almost half, and 15% of lesbian, gay, bisexual people had current thoughts around suicide or self-harm. So I'll talk a little bit now about the experiences of discrimination. So 25% had experienced verbal abuse. This is from the Private Lives 2 study, which was done by the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society at La Trobe University. 15% had been harassed in various forms, 8% had been physically threatened, and 7% had experienced a range of discrimination. Sure, yeah, question.
I was wondering if you know the percentages of people who are suffering from depression and anxiety outside the LGBT community?
I do have some of those figures here. I think I talked before about, so almost 25% of LGBT people met the criteria for a major depressive episode in 2005, which is compared to 7% for the general population. So that's one figure I have here. So we know it's higher across the board. Sure. So the Human Rights Commission also did a study recently, and that identified over 70% had ever experienced violence, harassment or bullying. 44% had ever been excluded from an organisation, an event or a service, and almost 25% had been refused a service that they wanted or needed. And again, when looking at the experiences of harassment or violence, discrimination, for all forms of abuse, so all of these, rates are highest for trans men and trans women. So again, trans people have worse experiences across the board. This is a 2010 study with young people, same-sex attracted and gender questioning young people. It's the Writing Themselves In report, which is a very significant series of 3 reports. So you can see the rates there. So interestingly, the rates of physical abuse over the 3 studies, so the first one was 1998, second in 2004, the third in 2010. The rates of abuse, physical abuse, increased over those 3 studies. So over time, the rates of discrimination have increased. So this is complex. It may be attributable to increasing numbers of younger people coming out over time, meaning they're a more visible target, as well as an increased understanding in young people about exactly what homophobia is and being able to name those experiences. But it's, as I said, a very complex thing to try and unpack exactly what's happening there. Beyond Blue funded the Equal Play study with the Victoria University, which was looking at the experiences of discrimination and harassment in sports settings specifically. And 20% of young people had experienced physical abuse, so that's PE, community sporting, those sort of team sporting environments. And 82% had heard homophobic language often or frequently. This is a study with gender diverse and trans young people called From Blues to Rainbows, and here you can see very significant rates of negative experiences, particularly noting 33% had reported that the uniform policy was mostly inappropriate for them. Also noting just over 40% of young people reported that changing rooms or toilets were mostly inappropriate for them. So in other words, an example would be a school forcing a young trans male to use a disability toilet rather than the male toilets. And we know that socially transitioning, being changing your name or pronoun and being recognised for making that transition and being recognised as the gender identity that you want to be recognised as, has very significant impacts in terms of validation and acceptance. So for school environments and peers and family to not recognise that, we know that has very significant impacts for young people's mental health and validation of who they are. So I'll talk a little bit about trying to identify exactly what the impact of these experiences of discrimination are for young people. So we know there's a relationship between harassment and psychological distress. So Beyond Blue often uses the K10 scale in their studies, which is the scale that measures psychological distress. So looking at the Private Lives 2 study I talked about before, recently Beyond Blue funded La Trobe University to look at that data and unpack what's happening in a bit more detail. And what we found in that was that those who had experienced harassment or abuse in the 12 months previous to completing the survey had higher psychological distress scores than those who hadn't experienced harassment or abuse. So there's a link there between harassment and distress. Similarly, resilience, so the ability, as I said, to bounce back, was lower for those who hadn't experienced harassment or abuse. So being discriminated against has an impact on your resilience, your ability to bounce back. Interestingly, we found, or that study found, that resilience doesn't change for trans females and bi women. But those two populations had resilience at the lowest level of all the population. So while it doesn't make, having an experience of discrimination doesn't make their resilience go any lower, that's probably because it can't go any lower. It's as low as it will go. So again, that's a very significant finding. This was the Human Rights Commission studies I referred to, showing that there are impacts for LGBTI people the study was with, in terms of being able to access support that they want or need. So 55% didn't feel comfortable disclosing their sexual orientation in a clinical healthcare setting. 42% felt uncomfortable disclosing their gender identity. And similarly for being able to be open about who they were in the workplace. So I'll talk a little bit now about the school environment and what appears to be happening in the school environment for younger people. So I talked before about how for younger people who've transitioned, having that transition validated, being recognised as the gender identity they've transitioned to is very, very important. So looking at unsupportive teachers, so teachers who misgender young people, who don't acknowledge the gender they're living as, who don't acknowledge uniforms, those sort of, there's a whole range of different ways in which teachers and others could be unsupportive to a young person. So when teachers do those sorts of things, we know that young people are over twice as likely to experience discriminatory language, or humiliation in the school. So possibly what's happening is teachers aren't supporting young people, so the young people around the trans young people or gender diverse young people are taking that as a signal. It's okay to discriminate against this young person, it's okay to call them names. So therefore the rates are higher. Similarly, they're more likely to receive written abuse or graffiti, and they're more likely to be bullied on social media. So the role of teachers and others in a school environment, sending a signal that it's okay to discriminate towards a young person, has a very profound impact on their experiences from their peers. Similarly, when young people are discriminated against, perhaps by their peers, but also have an unsupportive teacher, they're twice as likely to have an impact on their school marks and almost 4 times more likely to leave school. These are some, I think, very powerful tables which are taken out of the Writing Themselves in 3 report. So this is a table which maps out young people's experiences of discrimination from, I don't really like to say this because it's what level of abuse or discrimination is less worse than another kind, but it maps out the severity of abuse. So never experiencing abuse, experiencing only verbal abuse, or being physically abused. So it maps that out along the bottom. And then it maps out the proportion of young people up the side that had either thought about self-harm, which is the sort of purpley line, harmed themselves, the light blue line, thought about suicide, which is the pink thicker line, or attempted suicide, which is the red line. You can clearly see for each of those negative outcomes, as the experience is worse, so goes up the negative outcome. So young people who'd experienced verbal abuse have worse outcomes than young people who hadn't experienced abuse, and young people who've experienced physical abuse have worse outcomes than verbal abuse. Similarly for this table, which looks at severity of abuse against drug use, you can see the more severe the abuse, the changes in drug use. This is a very interesting table which looks at the rates of suicide attempts in young people and maps it against whether they had been supported or rejected after they've been assaulted. So in particular, looking at the bars at the very far end of the table, which looks at support from people in the school environment. So looking, for example, at the teacher, which is the fourth one from the end, you can see that young people who had been physically abused but had been supported, which is the light blue colour bar, had lower rates of suicide attempts than young people who hadn't been supported by teachers. So again, young people who are supported by teachers after they're abused are less likely to attempt suicide. And this is the same for the family. So again, mother, father, brother, sister at the very end of the table. Higher rates of suicide attempts when they're not supported by their family. Lower rates of suicide attempts when they are supported by their family after being discriminated against. So what are the take-home messages from all of this data and all this research? Well, rates of poorer mental health are higher in the sexuality and gender diverse populations, and anecdotally the same for people with intersex variations, but we currently don't have the data to confirm that just yet. Discrimination in various forms is unfortunately a very common part of the lives of many young people, LGBT young people. We know there's a relationship between discrimination and negative outcomes, which include, but is not limited to, poorer mental health. We know the negative outcomes are worse in some populations, including transgender and bisexual people. But we know that fostering supportive and accepting environments is as important as stopping discrimination. So it's more complex than just that statement, but we do know they're probably linked. We can't just stop discrimination, and we can't just foster supportive environments. We need to do it together to have the most impact. I think that's it. I'm only a little bit over time, so I will just wrap it up there.